All right. Well, welcome, friends. I am here with my dad. I'm excited to just have a casual conversation and share some stories. If you have read All Who Are Weary or you're planning on reading it, you might notice that there are a lot of stories about my dad that he agreed to share, but I don't know if he remembers which ones he agreed to share. But his fingerprints are sort of throughout this whole book. So I wanted to just give a little bit of background and kind of dive a little bit more deeply into some of those stories and have a conversation with him. So, welcome, Dad.
Welcome, welcome. Glad to be here. I wish
uh,
you were sitting next to me.
I know that would be good. Uh, okay, can you just start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself, who you are? I don't normally, want to ask people's age on these interviews, but I also don't think you care. But I think one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is because you've lived some life. So if you want to share, just yeah, a little bit about yourself in just a minute or so.
It's a little tough to talk about yourself all the time. Uh, but at any rate, here I am. I'm approaching my 80th birthday, and wrote a little something. The 90th Psalm was the only psalm that was written by Moses. He was a man of God. And Moses wrote in Psalm 90 and verse 10, the length of our days is 70 years, or 80 if we have the strength. Yet their span is but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away. That's really what happens. It goes pretty quick. And
Goes pretty quick.
it all depends on what we have to look forward to. And I look forward to an eternity with my Lord. This is what I've learned. I don't feel like I've reached the limit or anything else like that, but whatever it is, this seems to be some sort of a milestone. Um, in Psalm 71, verse 18, King David writes this, even when I am old and gray, do not forsake me, O God, till I declare your power to the next generation, your might to all who are to come. And that's exactly why I agreed to this, because I want the next generation to hear what God has done in my life and the fact that I feel like he's led me all those days, and it's been very, very good. So I have a lot to be thankful for, and I praise God for his work in my life down through the years.
I love that. So I will just give a little caveat to everybody as we dive in deeper. Dad and I are both criers, so so you've been warned if you're listening to this. So anyway, we are both big criers, so I hope that people have tissues nearby. But thank you for that, Dad. And I also should mention my dad's actual name is Dave. So Dave Anderson. I didn't even introduce that part, but
No, you got it wrong. My actual name
well,
is
your actual name
George
is George.
David,
Yeah, George David Anderson. That's right. Yeah.
but my
But
father was called George, so I was always David.
yep. So anyway, so we're gonna to that end, Dad. I'm glad you read those verses. To that end, I want to dive, if you're okay with it. I want to dive right into sort of some of those stories of ways that you've seen the goodness of God, ways that you've experienced maybe God giving you rest even in hard circumstances. That's kind of the theme of the book a bit is how can we find rest that's deep soul lasting rest that really doesn't depend on if our circumstances feel restful. So I want to dive in and I just want to hear really some of your stories and some of your testimony about that. So um, in one of my chapters, I write a chapter on worry, and I talk about what it looks like to let go of the burden of worry. And, Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. And sort of the theme of the book is that we are carrying a whole lot of burdens that are weighing us down that we don't have to carry. And one of those burdens is worry and fear. And we can let that down. And there's always things in our life that are hard or scary, but that sort of crippling worry is something that we don't have to carry. But I know in your life over 80 years, over four score, um, you've lived through some stuff that is very worrisome. And I just wondered if you could share some of those stories. And a couple that came to mind specifically are when you served in the military. And so if you could share just a little bit about some of your experiences with dealing with worry and how the Lord led you through that, in two particular seasons of life now. And I know we're going to get more into stories about mom a little bit later, but in two seasons that I was thinking of, one was when you were serving as a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, and then secondly when you ran a business and had filed for bankruptcy in your business. So could you just kind of share first about some of that military experience and worries that you kind of walked through and how the Lord led you through that?
Well, I kind of wish you had written this book when I was a lot younger, but you weren't around then. So I could have used that kind of a book. But I consider myself very, very fortunate to have been brought up in a Christian home. And my mom and dad, their main goal in life was to serve the Lord and to bring glory to his name. And that came across to me. However, in your youth, you kind of get carried away a little bit and a little bit of rebellion here and there. But somehow, through it all, the Lord never let go of me. And he sent me to the right school. I went to Taylor University out in Indiana and met my bride, your mom, Charlotte. And he gave us 47 years, which was great. But during that time, I thought I was doing pretty good. If I had to bring my grades up a little bit, I could bring my grades up, and I was doing pretty good. If I wanted to make the football team, I made the football team. I wasn't great, but I made the team and got to play a good bit. So that was good. Life was good. However, during that time, this was the early 60s, there was a draft going on, and we had a educational exemption from the draft. But once we graduated from college, we would be drafted. So I decided that rather than go in as enlisted, there was better money in going in as an officer. And so some friends of mine, and along with me, we signed up for platoon leaders class and officer candidate school of the United States Marine Corps. And when I graduated, we went 2 summers between semesters. We went to boot camp, which was the toughest thing I ever did in life. And somehow, by the grace of God, I made it through. And when I graduated from college, myself and my good friend Dave Horsey, both were commissioned as second lieutenants in the Marine Corps. I got married to Charlotte, and we traveled from Minneapolis to Quantico, Virginia. That was our honeymoon, driving through Canada and Niagara Falls to Quantico, Virginia to start my military career at the basic school as a basic officer training in the Marine Corps. While I was there, somehow I passed the physical for flight physical and the written test, and they sent me off to flight school in Pensacola, Florida, where we learned to fly. I almost got kicked out of flight school doing aerobatics in the old T-34, T-28, because I couldn't hold my stomach when we did the loops and the ailerons and the barrel rolls and spins and all that kind of stuff that we learned how to do. But once we learned how to do that, they gave us training landing on an aircraft carrier. And then I knew at that point that I was really good. I thought I was a great pilot, just landing on an aircraft carrier, even with an old prop, World War II prop aircraft. Shortly after that, graduated from that, and they sent me to California, Southern California. We lived in Santa Ana, California, and they transitioned me into helicopters. Within a few months of transition into helicopters, then we shipped off to Vietnam. While I was over there in Vietnam, it was quite an experience because I was scrambling to figure out why in the world the Lord would put me in a place like that. So I scrambled around with the chaplain. I tried to help the chaplain out a little bit and do some good things, trying to figure out why the Lord had me there. And little did I realize that he had some tremendous work to do in my life. He had to get a hold of my life in a special way, which he did. Some people have to be hit up by the side of the head with a 2x4 so God could get their attention. But that's what he did. I think what you're referring to is what happened in about May of 1968. Prior to that time, I had almost a year experience. I had flown 405 combat missions and had never been shot down. Well, here comes my opportunity. So we were assigned the role of Sparrowhawk, which was to stand by in the ready room, ready to go out to rescue anybody that got in trouble. So my co-pilot, my wingman, and I was sitting in a ready room, and they said, launch Sparrowhawk, which meant we run out to the helicopter, crank it up, and get going and rescue somebody. But he said something different. The operations officer says, go on over to the group headquarters. The colonel wants to see you before you go. So I ran over to the tent where the colonel was, the group headquarters. And the colonel said to me, Dave, he says, we've already lost 2 helicopters and crews in that zone. I don't want you to go in unless everything is right. I said, well, thanks a lot. That's a nice bit of encouragement. So we launched that afternoon and flew down to an area down by Da Nang Harbor. There was a platoon of Marines who had stumbled into a sapper battalion headquarters. The sappers were the enemy that went into Da Nang, blowing things up and stuff like that. And this platoon had stumbled into them, and 3 of their men had gotten seriously wounded, and with the possibility of dying if they weren't extracted by the morning. So we circled around, and while we were circling around, they first would fire artillery to drive the enemy back away from the platoon of Marines. And after the artillery stopped, then they would go in and they would go in with fixed wing, and the fixed wings would prep the area to drive the enemy back, to clear the area so that we could go in. And I can remember thinking to myself, I'm pretty good. I've got a lot of experience. I've been in and out of a lot of dangerous zones. I've been shot up a number of times. And I was the intelligence officer in the squadron giving the briefing to the other pilots in the morning. I was also a post-maintenance inspection pilot, so that when something was wrong with an aircraft, they would fix it, and then I would take it up and test it because I knew the aircraft inside and out. So I thought I was pretty good, but it got to the point where I wasn't good enough, and I knew I wasn't good enough, and I was saying to myself, this is it. So by the time they got done with the artillery and the fixed wing and had driven the enemy back a little bit, or we thought so, it was time to go in. The only problem was it was pitch dark and there was no moon. And all I had to shoot an approach on was some residual fires from the artillery and fixed wing. And the problem was up on the side of a mountain on the Hai Van Pass, which is Route 1. Route 1 was a dirt road that went through this pass going north and south in Vietnam. And they called it Highway 1. And I went through all the procedures, and I dumped down fuel to make myself light enough to extract. We had to bring them up by hoist to extract these poor Marines. What happened then was I said I dumped down fuel and I got ready, and I looked down on the beach. We were up at about 4,000 feet. At that level, you have to lighten the aircraft with all the weapons. We have 250 caliber machine guns and all the ammo, plus a gunner and a crew chief. and so we had to get a little bit lighter. And I looked down on the beach, and I saw some lights down below, and I figured if there was lights down there, that must be friendlies. And if there's friendlies when it happens, quote, when it happens, that's where I was going to try to get to. That was my plan B. Uh, so uh, I set up for the approach. And when I set up for the approach, I remember that's when I really learned how to pray.
Mm.
And I prayed that I thought I was finished. I thought I was a dead man. I said, Lord, I'm coming home. Tell Charlotte I love her, but I'm home. When I admitted to that fact, and I was ready completely to get to the point where I was going to die, there was a tremendous peace that swept over me, an unbelievable peace, an incredible peace, like it was a Sunday afternoon drive in the area, but it was in the middle of combat. And so we struggled to get ourselves in as close as possible. We were right over the area where the troops were, and the the troops have an FM radio. We contact air ground control and air control and other aircraft on the UHF radio, but the ground troops were using the FM radio. And the guy on the ground was screaming that I was within 10 meters of where he wanted me to be. So I'm moving over up the hill a little bit, and the rotor blades are chopping off some of the tops of the trees. And I'm trying to keep, without turning any lights on, trying to keep at a hover in the pitch dark, not knowing exactly where we were. And we got over the area, and the crew chief started dropping the hoist, and we were ready to start pulling them up. And all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose. And we actually took, I think, 28 hits, all of them in the bottom of the aircraft. So the enemy had to be within within the close distance to where the Marines were. So this happened, and the lights on the cockpit started lighting up like a Christmas tree. The warning lights. I started to say I was going to broadcast what was happening when we were going down, so people would know why we crashed. And I started broadcasting. We lost our number 2 generator, which was not a big deal because we had 2 of them, and we lost our number 1 boost. The boost was we had hydraulic boosts, dual hydraulic boosts, because there was redundant systems on the helicopters. If you lost one, the other would so hopefully keep you going. So we lost the 1 boost, went down to 0. Without hydraulics, you can't fly the aircraft, you just crash. And the second boost started wobbling. The gauge started wobbling, and I said, "Oh boy, this is it." And we started diving towards the beach that I had played as Plan B, and we ended up making it towards the beach and putting it down on the beach, and these people started coming out of the woods, and by the grace of God, they were all Marines. They surrounded the aircraft, and my wingman came in and picked me up, and flew us back to the base. And
Were you injured?
I was not injured.
Okay.
My gunner got wounded, and my co-pilot got wounded, but I was fine. Once again, somehow the Lord was watching over me. I didn't understand at that time the reason the Lord had me in Vietnam for any reason at all.
Mm.
That was, he was doing a job in my life and getting me ready for what he had in store for me in the days ahead. So we made it through that one. And shortly after that, I got sent home. The tour of duty was 13 months at the time. So that's basically the story.
Hmm.
After I went back. I became an instructor pilot uh, to teach the new guys how to fly the H-46, which is what we were flying. And then I politically went to the major, and they were starting a new school, a training school, to train enlisted people in the hydraulics and avionics and metals work and the systems on the aircraft. And they needed some coordination, so they gave me the opportunity to run the school. And I started the school called the TMU, Training Management Unit. And lo and behold, before long, I had one of the biggest commands on the base, just because I had all these students that I was coordinating. And I had a bunch of NCOs and staff NCOs that were,
How old were you at that time when you had that biggest command on the base?
that would be 1969, 69, 70, 43, 50,
So you were 26.
26. Yeah.
That just I feel like I'm not old enough to have
Well, it was wartime.
yeah, you grow up quick, I guess. My goodness.
So um, I I had the opportunity of signing up and going for another tour in Vietnam, and I didn't think that was uh, too too healthy. So uh, I we prayed. Charlotte and I prayed and prayed and prayed for God's guidance. I was thinking of going with the Missionary Aviation Fellowship, or I could go to work with my father in the business in Closter, or I could sign up in the Marine Corps and they would let me fly anything I wanted to fly. But I went and decided to get out and went to work with my father in Closter in the stone business. And that was the next thing that the Lord was leading me through, the ups and downs of business life. I spent 37 years in business. The first 10 was with my father until he passed away. And then things got exciting. Is that what you wanted to know?
That's what I wanted to know, just kinda hearing those stories. There's before we get into the business stuff, one other and you don't necessarily have to go into this, in depth if you don't want to, but one other story that you've kinda told is when you and mom were in Hawaii for an R&R, if I'm
Uh,
remembering correctly, and,
yeah,
the Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive.
yeah,
Can you tell us about that? Just
that was
that
January of
experience
1958.
tell us about that experience and just specifically your worry and what that looked like in that situation with mom.
Well, I was the intelligence officer at the time, like I said, and as a helicopter pilot, we were awarded several R&Rs to get us out of country and out of the action, so to speak. And so I got an R&R to Hawaii. And when I went to Hawaii, Charlotte was living in Southern California, and she flew to Hawaii to meet me. So we had 4 or 5 days in Hawaii in the Ilokai Hotel. And I can remember we were up on, I don't know, about the 15th floor. So in the morning, I went down into the lobby to to get some coffee, and I spotted the newspaper, and I picked up the newspaper, and lo and behold, the big headline was that the Tet Offensive had hit big, and all over the country. The country was basically blowing up. It was a major, major offensive, and I had inklings that something big was coming up. But then I saw in reading the paper, before I put it down, I didn't bring it up to Charlotte. I put the paper down. I wasn't going to pay for a paper like that. And so I, I, uh, I read that one of the toughest areas hit was this imperial city of Hue, which our base was 7 miles away from that, which I knew that our squadron was heavily involved in the work of trying to hang on to the city of Hue when it was under attack. And so I went we finished out a couple of days there. And when we went to the airport, Charlotte's plane was in the gate right next to my plane. My plane was being pushed out to go to Vietnam, and her plane was being pushed out to go back to Southern California. And I can remember looking through the window to see if I could have a last look at my dear wife, because then again, I thought for sure I was a dead man and I would never see her again. And because I knew what we were getting into. And lo and behold, the Lord preserved me through that. And we were able to get through it. That's the story. I don't remember
Well,
much else about it.
no,
It was a
that's
great
kind of what
week.
I wanted to that's what I wanted to dig into. Um, so moving forward now then a few years, so you came back to New Jersey where you grew up, and where grandpa had a business already established, and you came back to work with your dad in New Jersey. Um, and and then you took over the business after he passed, and then business was not good for quite a while
No,
at one
business
point.
was great.
Well, business was great, and then not that. Well, we don't need to go into the great part. I mean, that was, that's great, but the Lord gave you a season of fruitfulness there in business for a while, and then not so much. So, can you? Well, we're kind of fast forwarding here, what, a couple decades now, um, into the what, the early '90s,
The late 80s,
late
business was
'80s.
great. We were hitting a high point by 1987, and then the economy started going down the tubes.
And before we get into that more, sorry, Dad, I can you just tell us what was the business? Just tell people who don't know, what was the business doing?
We were in a building materials supply business, a stone business. We supplied stone for construction on houses, veneer stone, flagstone. We supplied landscapers. We supplied all kinds of retaining wall stones, and we had a nice little business going. And in 1987, because business was really cranking, I built a business. I built a building. The building was 300 feet long, and we were ready to really get going gangbusters. That's when the economy started going down the tubes. I call it the Great Recession. It wasn't as big as '29, but it was the economy really tanked, and my business was in deep trouble. And I started complaining to God and saying, "How can I glorify God when I can't pay my bills?"
Hmm.
And I went from 40 employees down to 6, and we lost 80% of our sales. So we were just there. It was with $1 million mortgage, and I couldn't pay the mortgage, and I was really struggling. Oh, by the way, so I got to tell you about the worst day of my life.
Ah, yes.
This was the date was December 16th, 1991. December 16th, 1991. This was when things were really, really bad. In fact, in that day, before noontime, we opened up at 7:30 in the morning, between 7:30 and noontime, all of these problems happened that I couldn't believe it. So what I did is I wrote it down on one of the little pads of paper. And I wrote it down here, my
That's the
script.
original list.
That's the original list, and it got so worn out that I had it laminated so I could hang on to it and I could know how God carried me through. But let me just read what happened. These are the events that happened on December 16th, 1991, between 7:30 in the morning and noontime. We came in and opened up, and I couldn't find the boom truck that was making most of our deliveries. And I called up the police department. I said, "I think somebody stole my boom truck." And it was a big, beautiful truck with a crane and everything. And the police chief said to me, "I'm sorry, Dave, but the truck has been repossessed." And that was a destroying thing. then what happened is the heat wouldn't come on. This was December. The heat wouldn't come on. There was no gas. So we called up the gas company to find out if we had paid the bill and how we were going to deal with that. And we found out that the meter was frozen. So that got fixed by 11 o'clock that morning. Then at the time, fax machines were the great way of getting orders. So found out that the fax machine was broken. We couldn't get the orders in. We had a 60-foot electronic scale for weighing the trucks, and the electronic scale was going bonkers. The readout was running all over the place because some of the wires had been chewed through by some squirrels, and so the scale was going bonkers. We needed a drill bit to finish up an order and called up the supplier. These are diamond tip drill bits that we use for putting holes in granite. And we called up the supplier and he told me we were on credit hold. And so I pleaded with him and got him to ship me the drill bit that we needed to finish that order. Lo and behold, in walks this one fella, a great big fella from Rockland Electric Company, which was the electric company, and we were late on paying our electric bill, and he was demanding a deposit of 3 times the size of what our typical electric bill was. And I had no money to pay him. Well, by the grace of God, once again, my bookkeeper jumped up, got in her car, drove up to the bank, withdrew money from the bank.
From her own account? Or
From her own account, and paid the electric bill. So we could keep the electric going, kept the saws going. Then after that, the bank called up. There were lease payments due. They wanted to repossess the forklifts. We had a 30 horsepower air compressor that supplied air throughout the whole building because air was needed for most of the machineries, the supplemental air. And the air compressor, one of the people came up and told me it was sucking oil and spitting out oil. And so that was going down the tubes. Then on top of that, one of my stone cutters had just finished an order of limestone treads and was bringing the order with the Heister forklift, bringing the order up to the place where we stored finished orders for them to be picked up. And as he was bringing the order up, one of the hydraulic hoses burst and spread hydraulic fluid all over the stone that was ready to be picked up. And we didn't have enough stone to redo the order. Following that, we had a Komatsu forklift, and the guys came up and told me the starter was shot. We sent out a delivery on a little GMC dump truck, which was like a Mason dump, and sent the delivery out, and the guy was 1 block away, and the clutch blew on it, and he coasted into the gas station that was next to our stone yard. Following that, the guys came in and told me I had a large Volvo dump truck with 4 big batteries in it, and all the batteries were shot, and they couldn't get the truck started. I had to buy new batteries. Then we had a bagging machine. We were bagging chips and pebbles and bagging rock salt and potassium chloride for ice melter. And the bagging machine broke down, and I can't remember what was wrong with it, but the bagging machine, all of this happened before noontime. And I said, I have to write this down. This is something else. So we worked through one thing after another. I had an epiphany. And the epiphany was that my job was to deal with problems. If there were no problems, they didn't need me. I was worthless. So my job was to take care of problems and work out problems. And that's what I spent the next few weeks working out the problems, getting my truck back and doing this, that, and the other thing. So my dear mother came up with a few $1,000 to pay the bank so I could get my truck back. So that's the greatest day of my life. I was learning to trust in the Lord.
Yeah, Yeah, so that's what I wanted to get into that. So in another chapter of my book, I talk about letting go of this burden of self-sufficiency where we, you
That's
know,
it.
we
You
we
hit the nail on the head. I thought
we
I was good. I was not good enough.
no, so we, you know, and that's praised, right? We want to be independent, we want to be competent, we want to, you know, pull our weight. But at the end of the day, we cannot ever be fully self-sufficient, right? And so when we are trying to be fully self-sufficient, we fail to depend on God and on others.
You ought to be
And
a preacher.
I learned from you with all your years of teaching. So you alluded to this a couple times in that relaying of that story, the you know, the woman who went and got money on her own and Grandma Anderson who helped chip in to get the boom truck back. How did during that time, either that immediate time around that sort of worst day of your life, and then just the 10 years or even more that followed of financial struggles and business struggles, how did others step up? And I know that they did. I've heard, you know, I've heard the stories. I've seen, you know, I was so if that day was in 1991, I was 5 years old. You know, so a lot of the stories I've sort of heard in hindsight a little bit. But can you just share a few more stories of how people around you uh, really helped carry your burdens during that time?
Yeah, we things got progressively worse. If they could get any worse, I couldn't believe it got any worse. And the bank came down to me one time. They had a big powwow, and I said to the banker, they wanted to make an appointment, and I said, "You mean should I have a lawyer present?" And oh no, that's not necessary. That's not necessary. So three of them came down: the chairman of the board of the bank, the president of the bank, who happened to be a Christian, uh, and that was part of God's provision, and the chief loan officer. And they wanted to give me uh, they wanted to give me another $100,000, and I says that'll just put me that much deeper in debt. I don't want to go deeper in debt. And so they said, well, finally they came around and said, look, Dave, we can't do this because you're a nice guy. You're going to have to file for bankruptcy. So I got myself an attorney who came up with a beautiful plan to get us into bankruptcy and have a plan to get us out of bankruptcy. And lo and behold, he didn't submit the work to the trustee in bankruptcy on a timely basis. So it came to the point where everything was going sour, and I had to go and fire my lawyer. And I showed up at his office first thing one morning, waited for him to show up, and fired him on the spot, and found another lawyer, a highfalutin lawyer, which the law firm we currently use. And I they took care of things right off the bat, but it costs a lot more money. When I was in trouble, the bank had come to me and said, Dave, we want you to file for a loan guaranteed by the New Jersey Economic Development Authority, and then we'll rewrite the mortgage. So they did that, and they said that's when they said they couldn't do it because I was a nice guy. They had to do it because they had to get it through their stockholders and through the Treasury Department of the Banking Commission. So they forced me to file bankruptcy, Chapter 11. Uh, so I did, and I called up every one of my vendors, and every one of them but one stuck with me
Hmm.
and helped me out through the crisis because of our previous, I guess it would be integrity, you would say, but they knew that I was going to be good for it eventually. And so the vendor stuck with me, the bank stuck with me, but then in the process, they gave me a $2 million mortgage. I couldn't pay a $1 million mortgage. How am I going to pay a $2 million mortgage? But it was guaranteed by the New Jersey Economic Development Authority. So we had a big powwow at the bank headquarters with everybody sitting around the table, the lawyers, the accountants, the New Jersey Economic Development Authority, all of them sitting around the table, determining what to do with me, whether or not to shut down the whole thing and sell everything or keep me afloat. At the time, I can remember I said to them, I said, look, I don't have a house up in the mountains. I don't have a cabin down the shore. I don't have anything else. I says, I got an old Chrysler Skylark out there, and the air conditioning doesn't work. But I took the keys and I threw them across the table to the guy from the New Jersey EDA, and I said, you can have the car, but otherwise I've got nothing. Well, they kept me in business, and they gave me they guaranteed the loan and rewrote the mortgage. And I put some money in the bank to pay the next few payments so I could survive a little bit more. And I went back to my office, and here's the great part. I was sitting at my desk, and I called my attorney to thank him and tell him what I had done and where we had gone and what we were going to do next. And it was just at that time where the economy was opening up again, and I could sense that things were coming back. And so I was sitting there talking to the lawyer on the phone, and this girl walks in with the biggest basket of fruit, huge basket of fruit, and put it on my desk. And I said, what in the world is this? And I got up and I picked out the card, and it says, best wishes for independence, best wishes for future success, Independence Bank. The bank sent me a basket of fruit. I couldn't believe it. So the next morning, I knew the president of the bank got in there early in the morning, 7:30 in the morning. So I went up to the bank at 7:30 in the morning and knocked on the window, and he let me in, and we sat down in his office. And I just told him how much I thanked him for sticking with me, that he was God's provision. And at that point, in walks the chairman of the board, the tough guy who wanted to put me out of business. And I said to him, I said, Mr. Napolitano, I just want to say thank you for letting me stay in business. And he says, oh no, he says, we should thank you. I said, for what? He says, we should say thank you for not throwing in the towel. Lo and behold, at that point in time, this was in the mid-90s, the Treasury Department was walking in, shutting down banks left and right. They would march in and throw everybody out and take over the bank. And they were just about ready to take over this bank that I had this mortgage with. And they would have taken it over, but we solved the issue temporarily anyway. And, so
There's there's so much more I know we could dive into. So I want people to understand too, at this point, when this is all happening, you have 6 kids, ages 5 to 22 at this point. So you've got mouths to feed, which is just adds another layer of stress, I'm sure, to all of it. One story, and I don't know if I'm hearing the story, if I'm remembering it correctly, but one story that I remember hearing inklings about is, and correct me on this, you had tried to come up one time with Christmas bonuses for the few employees you had or something.
yeah.
And then what happened after you tried to just come up with a meager Christmas bonus for them? What happened?
Every year I would give them a Christmas bonus. And I think part of my problem was I was a little too liberal on the bonuses and the pay. But they knew that I was in deep trouble. And I came up with a few bucks, and I gave them each a few bucks. And they had been down in the coffee room having coffee. And the shop supervisor came up to my office and he handed me back all the money. He says, "You need this more than we do." He gave me back all the money. So it was good. So the Lord kept taking care of us. The Lord kept taking care of us. In the midst of it, I was teaching at the church, and I went to the senior pastor and the director of Christian education, and I sat down with a meeting, and I said, "Lord, I don't want to shame my Lord. I don't want to bring any embarrassment to the church, but please don't take my Sunday school class away." And the director of Christian education said to me after she knew the story, she says, "Why don't you teach the book of Job?"
Mm.
So all during this, I was teaching the book of Job from chapter 1 to chapter, what is it, 40 or 42 or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's what carried me through. I had to teach what Job was going through,
Mm.
and mine wasn't near as bad. Mine was nothing compared to his. So working through the scriptures was a key part of it.
Yep.
Well,
Yep.
lo and behold, that wasn't the end. Do you want to hear the end story?
Keep going. Keep going.
Well, we got on our feet. We had to, I remember Jennifer was out at Taylor. We had to pull her back from school, and she went to a local community school. Matthew was accepted, and he couldn't go to college because we didn't have any money. I don't know how Eric stayed in school, but maybe he was, whatever. But Bonnie stayed in school because she was down at Rutgers, and every time a credit card application came through, she would apply and get $1,000 credit, and she would go and pay her tuition. So she was in deep debt by the time she graduated. But that's what happened. That's how everybody worked together. The greatest Christmas we ever had was at that time. You remember that?
I remember that. Yep. We nobody could afford to buy any presents, so the rule was you had to regift presents. And we
Yeah.
had we had a mountain of gifts under
So
that tree.
everybody went down in the basement, pulled out the old toys that were up on the shelf, pulled out the wrapping paper and wrapped the toys and regifted to each other stuff that we had already gotten. And that
Yep.
was the greatest Christmas ever.
Yep. Yep.
So
Yep.
that was the
Did
regifting Christmas.
the regifting Christmas is an infamous one in our family. Yep.
So then everything was going to go smooth, and we were setting up the house to have a big Christmas party with the Nelson family, which is my mother's side of the family, would meet every Christmas day to have a family reunion, and we were having 42 people for a sit-down dinner at our house. We had tables set up in the basement, in the living room, in the dining room, in the family room, and we had people coming to dinner. And the day before, Charlotte comes down the stairs and she says, "I don't feel so well." And she says, "I think I better go to the doctor."
So let's catch up just on the timeline now. What year is this?
Probably 2009.
2010 actually, because I remember it was the first Christmas Colson and I were married. So now we've moved past bankruptcy in the 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah.
All of us kids have moved out of the house. Either I was the youngest. I got married last, so this is 2010. So I had just got this was Christmas of 2010. I had just gotten married in May. And so you guys are empty nesters at this point, but still family in the area, extended family in the area. So just wanting to kind of clarify the timeline. Now we're talking 2010.
I'm glad you remember, because I can remember, it all mushes together at this stage.
Yeah. Yeah.
You try to get all these memories out of me, and it's all one time. The timeline. So at any rate, she comes down the stairs and she says she's really sick. So we called up the doctor and says, she's really, really sick. We went to this doctor, another one of God's provisions. She was a Christian lady from the church. And she took one look at Charlotte and said, "You're jaundiced." And she immediately sent us over to a gastroenterologist. And the gastro guy says, "You got a serious problem." And he says, "I got to set you up for surgery." She had pancreatic cancer. And so Christmas Day, they set us up for surgery. And they set us up with this Buddhist guy. And for Christmas Day, they couldn't find an anesthesiologist. They found a Jewish one who wasn't celebrating Christmas. So we took the Buddhist guy and the Jewish guy, and we went to the hospital for surgery. And she had major surgery. She had what's called the Whipple procedure, which they take half of your insides out, trying to stem the cancer that was spreading in her life.
That's the non-medical definition of the Whipple procedure. They take half your insides out. But just about, they take all kinds of stuff out and reconnect everything. And
So then we finally had the chance, after the dust settled, to check out this surgeon and find out if he was any good. They couldn't do it arthroscopically, or the easy way. They had to do it the old-fashioned way, cut her open, because they couldn't get the technicians to come on Christmas Day because it had to be done right away. So we checked out the bio of this surgeon after the fact and found out he was one of the best surgeons in the country for this kind of a procedure. He had done several hundred of these Whipple procedures, and this was no thing to him. He claimed he was the Everest of surgeries, but he had done it many times, and we were quite reassured. That again was another one of God's provisions. So therefore, they took out half of Charlotte's insides, and we went home to heal. It took quite a while, and then you reminded me that it was probably 10 months after that I went for a checkup at the doctor's office, and everything looked great. I went back to my office at the church. I was on the church staff by that time. And I went back to my office and got a phone call from the doctor, and he says, "We need to take another blood test." I said, "Okay, I'll make an appointment." He says, "No, we need to take it right now." I said, What do you mean right now?" He says, "You get over here. How soon can you get here?" I said, "I can be there in 15 minutes. So I went over to the doctor's office, and they took a blood test and checked it out. And he came into the room and he says, "You got cancer." I said, "Oh, great. We got multiple myeloma cancer, and it's a blood disease." And so the question is now, both Charlotte and I both have cancer. And so we were both on chemo treatments, and it was a big scene because we sat side by side in the chemo lab. She was on one side getting her chemo, and I'm getting the other chemo. And it was.
you guys had the same oncologist. I remember going to a back-to-back joint appointment with you guys.
Yeah, we had the same. She was good. Louise Legresti, I remember. So she was really good. Things progressed along for a year or so, and then we realized this was terminal. We knew it was terminal. In the meantime, I had chemo, and then I had a stem cell transplant, and I was actually doing pretty good. But we had a family get together down the shore. We rented a house. And things were getting worse for your mother. So we went to the doctor's appointment And the doctor started telling us the facts of life, that this was terminal. She says, Charlotte was saying she was miserable on the chemo. And the doctor was saying, well, we can keep you alive another 3 months until Christmas by strong chemo treatments. And I can remember your mother saying, I got a choice between making it to Christmas or going home to glory. So we decided it was time to go on hospice. And we checked out hospice care. And one of our close friends in our Bible study was a hospice nurse. So we called her over and asked her to tell us what was going to happen. And she told us exactly what was going to happen, gave us confidence that these hospice people knew what they were doing. And it was not a fine procedure, an okay procedure. Well, it was a period of time where she was on hospice care that the hospice people were absolutely terrific. And lo and behold, that hospice nurse, 5 years later, I ended up marrying. So another one of God's
Provisions.
Your mother was Carol's mentor and Bible study teacher for 15 years. And when I was teaching on Monday evening at the Monday evening Bible school, your mother had said that she was going to start a Bible study, which was a very effective Bible study with a group of ladies. And so things were plugging along. And eventually, well, Charlotte made it past Christmas, but she made it to February. And then the Lord took her home.
When you kind of going back to the time when mom had been diagnosed, she had gone through the surgery, had gone, I think was maybe through an initial round of chemo, if I'm remembering, and then you got diagnosed. What kind of went through your head when you got that diagnosis? I mean, not just sort of the problem solving of like, what do we do now? And here's, we already got an oncologist and stuff like that, but kind of what spiritually and emotionally was going on in your mind and your heart and with you and mom?
Well, the one thing that goes through my mind is the fact that people had been saying the Lord helps those who help themselves. And I determined that that was theologically incorrect. The Lord helps those who are flat on their back and
Mm.
have no place to turn but to Him. And that's the way it was. Now, I had expected that I was a dead man many times, I told you. And I looked at it and I said to myself, well, we just do our homework. That's what the Lord expects of us, just do our homework, do what seems logical at the time, and trust in the Lord that He's going to take care of it. And so, in trusting in the Lord that He was going to take care of it, I can remember your mother getting weaker and weaker and struggling all the more. And here I was as a caregiver, which I was not trained to be a caregiver. But I can remember her raising her hands and looking up, ready to go up to heaven. And the question was, how long is it going to be? It's a waiting game. You wait and you wait and you wait and you cry and you try to remember and you try to encourage one another, but it's a waiting game. And you wait on the Lord, trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct your paths. So we took it one step at a time. And we had the hospice people there. We had the church supporting us. We had old friends visiting us.
So that was actually my next question is how did you see, kind of more specifically, what are some ways that the church specifically and people, I'm using church kind of capital C as well as your local church. How did they step in during that season?
Well, people were bringing us meals on a regular basis, which was to my benefit because your mother couldn't eat, and I was eating like a pig. So I was much blessed. the visits, we had people. We were reminded we were in a much better situation financially, but we were reminded of the fact that when times were really, really tough, when we were in bankruptcy and all kinds of financial problems years earlier, we can remember that one friend, close friends, gave us $40 so we could go out and buy a Christmas tree. And somebody else left money in the mailbox, left a couple of $100 in the mailbox. Somebody else brought us bags of groceries, including steaks. We're eating steaks dinner during those times, and God was very, very good. And so while we were in trouble, with sickness, and your mother was on hospice care, the church rose up, and God's people were a great blessing to us, and they were praying for us, and they were helping us.
So with that, I know one of the things that I myself have struggled with, and I know a lot of people struggle with, is when someone you love or somebody you know in your community is hurting, you just don't know what to do. You kind of feel helpless. How can I support them? I don't want to be a bother. I don't want to be, you know, knocking on their door if they don't want visitors. Just kind of that feeling of like, I don't want to get in the way, but I also want to, you know, be helpful or show them that we care. Um, how how did you navigate that, or what would you say to someone who is wanting to be supportive to somebody and help carry the burdens of others, but just is kind of a little bit nervous about how to do that well and just kind of not wanting to be a burden themselves?
Well, there were a couple of things. Uh, Number one is that you don't have to say anything. Uh, Keep your mouth shut. Your presence is very important. The fact that you care enough to be involved, maybe a phone call or a card, uh, can be a great encouragement. I can remember after your mother died, how many cards I got. The mailbox was full every day of cards from people at church, at Fred's. Very encouraging. But a visit is nice. I was a visitation pastor at the church when I was on staff, and as such, I made a lot of visits to people who were in tough shape, and I did a lot of funerals at the time. And so I knew what people were going through because I had personal experience. And you don't have to say a whole lot. It's not a question of giving advice, it's just being there to support. Uh,
I
Once in a
remember.
while,
Oh, go ahead.
portion of scripture is good, but I have some favorite portions.
What were some of those?
Well, First Peter chapter 1 is one of my best. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who comforts us. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4 is a portion of comfort. There's several verses like that, but
Yeah.
even that is a bit of encouragement. But
I remember one time when I was out there for a while, and part of this was when, we had landlines, people didn't have their own cell phones. And one of my kind of jobs when I was helping out when mom was really sick was just to kind of answer the phone and just help, sort of be the doorkeeper, so to speak, with the phone. And people would ask, I remember asking mom something like, um, people are sort of wondering, are they being intrusive if they keep calling? They don't, you couldn't silence your phone because it was, again, a landline. So people were sometimes telling me, I don't want to, I won't call if it's intrusive, or I don't want to wake your mom up, or, stuff like that. And I was like, Mom, what do you want me to tell people? And I remember her telling me, I'd rather people call and I don't have the energy to speak to them than lay here and wonder, why is the phone not ringing?
hmm,
And just that feeling of like, most of the time at that point, she was way too tired to have any sort of conversation beyond a few words. But I remember her just sharing with me that when she's laying in that, at that point, I think there was the hospital bed in your bedroom, that just the fact that the phone was ringing sort of indicated like people care, like people haven't forgotten about me yet, and I've shared that with a lot of people since then, because I think we think some of those things aren't a big deal, or they don't make a difference, or they don't, the cards or whatever, stuff like that. But what I'm hearing you say, and what I remember mom saying, is that so-called little stuff actually really does make a difference.
I look at that through war, through financial troubles, through business problems, through health problems, through raising children problems, all of those
You
things.
had it all figured out by number 6.
No, that's where we really blew it. So God has always been there, and
I want to, if it's okay with you, Dad, I want to read something that you had written in your Caring Bridge. We had a Caring Bridge site that Dad would update regularly.
that was a big help. That was a great
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
With the Caring Bridge site, a website that you could, in fact, we have relatives now that use it. You can tell the world, basically, anybody that is you allowed to sign on to Caring Bridge on a daily basis, they can find out how the loved one is doing.
Yep.
And that was a great site.
You wrote, and this is actually in the book. I don't know if you remember that this is in the book, but this is in the book.
I haven't read the book.
Well, you signed off on me including this. So this is in the book, and it's an excerpt from one of your Caring Bridge entries, and I'm going to read it. This was when Mom was pretty sick, kind of in the last couple months, I believe. And you wrote, "Charlotte is sleeping quietly now as I try to keep occupied with the day in and day out routine of being a caregiver. I must admit I'm struggling. Winning and losing on the athletic field in high school and college, USMC boot camp, 1 year in the middle of an ugly war, raising 6 kids, trying to calm hurting fellow believers at church, 10 years of business financial struggles. Nothing hurts as much as watching the love of your life slowly deteriorate. I don't know how else to express it. Each day, Charlotte needs a little more help with some of the very basics. One day she gave me a quote from C.S. Lewis. We are not necessarily doubting that God will do the best for us. We are wondering how painful the best will turn out to be. I wonder what he is doing, but I know that he has the best in store for us. There is the greatest comfort of all. How painful will the best turn out to be? I don't know, but I'm glad that both Charlotte and I have the assurance that he knows, he cares, and he loves us with an infinite love." You wrote that.
I can't believe I wrote that.
Pretty good. Pretty good.
Well, there's something I didn't write, but I believe. And after going through all of these situations, one thing after another, knowing that God is in control, and he's in control of my life, whether I wanted it or not, he was there always for me. And Apostle Paul writes in Philippians, he says, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. And if I'm to live on in the faith, what should I choose? It is far better for me to depart and be with Christ, but it is more necessary for your sake that I remain. And convinced of this, I know that I shall remain for your progress and joy in the faith." So I look back and I realize that I struggled to live the Christian life, to follow the Lord's leading as much as I could, realizing how stupid I was a lot of times, not following God's guidance. And still he was there. He was still there with me. And I can look back right now and I can say, no regrets, no regrets. I don't regret any of it. Cut.
I love that. Well, thank you, Dad. We are grateful to hear from your 80 years of wisdom and experience, and I think most of all, just hearing how God has done good things in your life. And I one verse that comes to mind is Psalm 66. It says, "Come and hear, all you who fear God, and I will tell you what He has done for my soul." And
Yeah,
I just appreciate you sharing that with us and just sharing what God has done for your soul. So thanks, Dad.
good. I love you.
Love you too.